So today I would like to talk about the Panasonic S1 for video makers. I know that this camera is marketed mainly as a hybrid photo video camera, but there are a few things you can do to get this up to spec with something like a GH5 in terms of codecs, and I think it's just a really great camera for not that expensive overall. So this camera for me naturally kind of came as a GH5 upgrade because I was a little just over the low light capabilities that the GH5 was lacking. So I got this camera to basically replace that one. It retails for $1997 plus with the Vlog upgrade for another $199. You're looking at about $2,200 total for this camera, but compared to other full frame cameras out there, it has a lot more features than you'll find. So I would like to go over a few of those today and talk about why it's sort of like the natural next iteration to the GH5 and why I'm skipping over the Panasonic S1H to keep this camera instead. So how I would like to break this video down is mainly just do like a pro-con list, because this is going to be more of a practical video from using this camera for the past few months now. So for the first pro for this camera, number one thing for me is 10-bit color at this point. Internally, you can't get this camera just right out of the box with 10-bit color unless you use the HLG profile, which I'm not a huge fan of. So if you buy the Vlog upgrade, it essentially gives you that Vlog 10-bit codec to use with this camera. So that's a really, really important thing to know, is you have to be able to unlock the full capabilities of it, you have to have that $199 upgrade as well. Still, like I said, it puts you at about $2,200 compared to Sony a7S II or just some other full frame cameras out of the market right now. That's still not a bad price for the amount of features you get with this camera. So another thing is the 4K 60 frames per second. That's pretty much standard these days. That's why I love the GH5 so much. That's why I like this camera. It has a full frame sensor, so it gives you that shallower depth of field, that better low light sensitivity, and with better low light sensitivity, it also has a dual native ISO. So at the lowest ISO, native ISO setting, you'll have your cleanest image, and at your second native ISO setting in low light, you'll have a clean image. So that's another huge, huge bonus about this camera for me, is the dual native ISO. The next thing, it has amazing internal stabilization so that you can use vintage primes. I have a couple Contax vintage primes and a couple Canon vintage primes that I like to use. So those work great on this camera. The next pro for me is the tilty screen on this camera. The S1H has a flip out screen, but this has a sort of a tilt screen like you've seen on some of the APS-C cameras and like the Sony a7S II. It has this tilting screen, and for me that's actually more preferential because I don't really like the flip out screens that you can turn into selfie mode like on the X-T4. I like to actually look down at the screen because I'm a lot taller than most people anyway, so I like to look down at what I'm filming. So that is more of a pro for me. I could see how this is a con though, because a lot of people really value the flip out screen for things like YouTube videos. But I view that as a pro. The next pro for this camera that I want to mention is the price difference between the S1H and this camera. The S1H retails on B&H for about $3,500 right now, whereas this one with the Vlog upgrade is $2,200. So that is a $1,300 price difference. That's quite a bit for me to spring for a video-centric camera. I don't really view this camera as a photo-centric camera, even though it is a hybrid. $3,500 is a little too much to not have a camera with sort of cinema-grade specs. I think the S1H might get those updates in the future, but as of right now, I couldn't justify that $3,500 price tag. So for some more pros, it has pretty good color science. I wouldn't say it's the best, but I think for Panasonic, I think it has a really good color science. I know they shift a little on the magenta side, so skin tones get a little magenta colored, but I don't think it's a bad color science by any means. It just sometimes requires a little bit of work. The battery life on this thing is really quite amazing. I usually get about an hour to an hour 20 of shoot time, depending on what I'm doing. I've always had a lot of good experiences with just one battery with this camera, and then it can also be rigged up with like a V-mount or something via USB. But I haven't had to do that often because the battery life has been so good for it. So now I would like to get into some cons about the Panasonic S1, and these are going to be just Panasonic S1 cons. They're not going to be cons relative to the S1H. So the first con that I have is that it's actually kind of big. It's not gigantic by any means, but it's definitely bigger than like a Sony a7S II or a Nikon Z6, and it's definitely like noticeable when you're using it. So that's why I got this Tilta cage, and it comes with this hand grip, but it's not a bad camera and it's not a bad size. It's definitely small relative for what it puts out. At the end of the day, it is a little big. There aren't many audio features with this camera as well. It has a really hot signal. I think it has a really hot feed, so the lowest that you can lower the audio signal to is -12 decibels, which for some mics is kind of hot. On the Asden SCM 250 that I have, it can be a little too hot at times. So that's kind of a problem, but not a huge one if you're not recording directly into camera. I like to record directly into camera just because it's more convenient, and I might be lazy, but whatever, that's fine. And like I said, again, with the tilt screen, that can be a con for you if you prefer the flip out screen. That is something that the S1H does have, but for something that I'm gonna be behind the camera mostly, for commercial projects, I think I would prefer to have the tilting back screen. And I like to use a monitor anyway, so I'm not 100% reliant on that little flip screen. But if you prefer a flip out screen to do sort of like selfie style, that could be seen as a con to you. Another big con is that it doesn't have really reliable autofocus at all. I think with the final updates, the GH5 ended up having better autofocus than it, but I use a lot of, like I said, a lot of vintage prime lenses, so I'm not too reliant on autofocus these days, other than that's why I use something like the Fujifilm X-T4 for my autofocus needs, like YouTube stuff, but it doesn't have really good autofocus. I imagine it'll get better with firmware updates, but as of right now, in 2020, early 2020, well, mid 2020, I guess, it's not very good. This camera also doesn't have 10-bit slow motion like the S1H does built into it. Even with the Vlog upgrade, you're still only limited to 4K 60 in an 8-bit codec. It's not the worst thing in the world. 4K 60 is kind of the standard these days, so I think 10-bit slow motion might be a little too much to ask for, but at the end of the day, it doesn't have it, and the S1H does. I'm pretty certain it does. If it doesn't, fact check me on that. Another con that I see with this camera is that it's not really the most inspiring photography camera. They market it as a hybrid photo video camera, but I'm not really into it for photography because it's just so big and bulky. People who are kind of used to DSLRs wouldn't be too thrown off by how bulky it is, but I've always used Fujifilms and the little Sonys for photography, so I'm kind of a little thrown off by the size for photography. It's just not inspiring to me, but for video, I think it's really fun to shoot video with. And then finally, my final main con with this camera is that there aren't a lot of lens options, like native lens options. So if I wanted to get a sharp prime lens that's a native lens with autofocus, or a sharp zoom, there aren't many options that aren't super expensive right now. They have it's an L-mount camera, so they have the Panasonic Leica lenses for this camera, but they all run really, really expensively. But I do know that Sigma has released some lenses with this L mount, so luckily they're started bringing in some cheaper options. But as of right now, there aren't a ton of options out there for native lenses on this camera. I don't know what's in store for that, or if they plan to release any cheaper or sort of just different branded lenses than the Sigmas. But as of right now, there aren't a ton. So that's another con in my opinion. Although, like I said, I like to use a lot of the older adapted lenses to it, so it's not that huge of a con to me. So overall, it's a really great alternative to the S1H if you're looking to upgrade from the GH5 and you're not super keen on needing autofocus. Like I said, for me these days, I don't use autofocus nearly as much as I used to, and on commercial jobs, I wouldn't use autofocus anyway, so it's not that huge of a con for me. If you do YouTube videos, this camera might be a pain due to the lack of the flip out screen and the autofocus, but for commercial work, I think this is a really, really strong option. So here's my hot take of this video. It's not even that hot of a take, it's more of a lukewarm take. I don't think people are paying enough attention to this camera. I think they're sort of glancing over it and going directly to the S1H. And while the S1H is a really amazing camera, it's super expensive and not quite accessible for a lot of people. Not to say that a $2,200 camera is even accessible for a lot of people, but I think you can make this camera like 90% of what the S1H is with that Vlog upgrade, and you can, really get most of the features that most people need without, shelling out that extra $1,300 or whatever the difference is. Again, I think you should check out the Panasonic S1 if you're looking to upgrade from the GH5. If you like this video, I think you should also like it with the thumbs up button and the subscribe button, and you should do all that stuff because I'm gonna start posting a lot more videos these days because I'm free from the world and it's Corona time and we're just staying safe out here and Black lives are still mattering. So stay safe out there and I will see you in another video.